everybody to this evening's workshop and talk with Steve Shaw, where we'll talk about power for people. It's good to have a good group of people here, and I hope we'll all get something from it, as I'm sure we will. As usual, we will begin with an opening prayer, which Steve has provided, but I'll read it. It comes from the Right Reverend David Walker, Bishop of Manchester. So let us pray. Heavenly Father, you have taught us through your servant St. Francis that all creation is your handiwork. Grant us your grace that we may exercise wise stewardship of this earth, tread lightly upon it, and cherish its resources, that our children may enjoy its riches throughout all generations, and your name be glorified through all that you have made. Amen. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Steve Shaw, who is Director of Power for People. And in this, he'll give an update on the campaign for a new UK law to accelerate the growth of community-led renewable energy schemes. In the last Parliament, they brought together a cross-party group of 326 MPs on board in support. They now need as many MPs as possible to ask the government to include community energy in the Great British Energy Bill, which I think has a new name now. Steve will talk to that. Before founding Power for People in 2017, Steve worked on a number of environmental campaigns, including the campaign for the Climate Change Act. He grew up in Sydney, Australia, where he spent a lot of time playing rugby and swimming. And after studying economics at Exeter and a brief stint in the city, he began working on cross-party parliamentary campaigns and has been doing so for nearly 20 years. And you can find out more about Power for People at powerforpeople.org.uk. So for the next 20 minutes or so, Steve is going to speak to us. Then we will have the breakout rooms with a question to focus on, when they'll last for 15 minutes. And then we'll close the breakout rooms and people come back for Q&A. So at this point, I think I'm ready to hand over to Steve, and we look forward to hearing what he has to tell us. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have so much I can tell you, but I'm going to have to be careful not to go off on too many tangents. Now I'm going to begin with some sort of first principles. Some of you may know or have heard this, but I think it's important to cover it anyway. So yes, my background is in parliamentary campaigning, and I worked on quite a number of legislative campaigns, a few of which was when I was at Friends of the Earth. I set up Power for People in 2017, and we have two leading aims. One is to accelerate the UK's transition to renewable energy, but the other is, and we see this as equally important, to make sure that local people and local communities are benefiting from the transition. It's extremely important. And to go off on the first tangent, as we try and get to climate safety, there is a real risk that we're going to see a backlash. The initial carbon reduction that the UK has pushed for and achieved has been the low-hanging fruit, really. And it's very topical, actually, because, of course, this week we saw the closure of the last generating coal power station in the UK. We've seen the largest offshore wind farms in the world constructed off our shores as well. And that's all fantastic. But this is the low-hanging fruit. This is the easy stuff. To put it another way, it's the stuff that most people, whilst they might have heard about, it's not really affecting them directly. But if we are going to get to climate safety, it's going to start affecting people's lives more, as our vehicles need to change to non-fossil fuel powered, and as our heating needs to change to non-fossil fuel powered. And the risk of a backlash against the changes that are going to start to be felt more by everyone is going to be there. Imagine a Nigel Farage kind of character, or perhaps even Mr. Farage himself, coming along and whipping up anti-sentiment towards these feelings. And that is why it is so critically important that it's not just big infrastructure, but that people can see and feel benefits to their lives, to their communities that are happening as a result of the transition. So that's why we have those two aims. The campaign that we have been running for several years is for something called the local electricity bill. And this is a way of enabling growth in what's called community energy. So talk about community energy for a bit. Community energy is a broad term, but largely it means where groups of people locally get together and either wholly or in part build and own and run local renewable energy generation infrastructure. Now, there's some community energy groups that also do work to do with energy efficiency, and some actually to do with low carbon transport. But primarily, it's about smaller scale renewable generation. Now, what's really interesting in the UK is there's a few hundred of these groups, but they are, as a sector, it's very small. At the moment, generating about 0.5% capacity of our total electricity generation. So very small. But what's also very interesting is the sector could grow massively. There's been studies such as one done in the last Parliament by the Environmental Audit Committee that said that within 10 years you could see a 20-fold growth in the generation of the sector with the right enabling policies. And that's where our campaign comes in. So we say that the single biggest change that could happen that would see that growth potential realized is to enable community schemes that are generating electricity to sell the power directly to local people. Now, it's not actually illegal to do so. The trouble is that the rules and regulations that currently govern our energy system, they make it financially impossible. They put very large burdens and costs on anyone who wants to sell to end customers. You need to be what's called a licensed suppliers. Now, we know the licensed suppliers. You'll know the names. Very large utilities like EDF, E.ON, npower, etc. And those rules were set up in the early 90s when the energy system was privatized. And they were, to a degree, they made sense at the time. It was an attempt to bring in some competition, whatever you may think about that. And it was an attempt to create a structure around that. And it also fitted the fact that back in the 90s, we didn't have distributed generation. We had big power stations generating electricity and sending it out down the wires to homes and businesses, etc. And so that regulatory structure largely fitted that reality. But of course, what we now find ourselves in is a very different reality. Massive amounts already of distributed generation, solar, and also at all levels of scale, wind turbines as well, and other units, biomass, some hydro. So the rules and the regulations haven't really changed very much. And they obviously, therefore, are now antiquated when it comes to the fact that there is all this renewable generation and there is the potential for so much more. So it's about changing the rules. So often, when you really want to change a problem, and climate, I think, is one of the best examples, you've got to change the rules. So that's what we're trying to do with the local electricity bill. It would establish a situation where the costs were proportionate. If you wanted to sell to local customers, you were facing proportionate costs and burdens. And so we have been mobilizing support. We always work cross-party, and we always seek public support and ask people and groups to lobby their local MP. So we work in a democratic way in that method, which is very effective. And yes, as was mentioned earlier, thank you, David, in the last Parliament, we built up support to 326 MPs for that bill. What we also did in the last Parliament was we took the two parts of the local electricity bill. It's structured in two parts. If you care to sort of look on our website, you can see it. And we made those two amendments to the government's energy bill last year, about a year ago this was. And then what happened was the government offered us a deal. This is the Conservative government last year. They said, look, this is complicated. We're not against it in principle, but we don't agree and support it. So what we'll offer you is we're going to set up a new community energy fund, a government scheme that will give grants to groups that want to start new community energy schemes. It will be £10 million over 2 years. And we had a choice to make at that point. What we could have done was push the campaign and push the MPs who supported it and push it to a vote in the House of Commons. And it was substantial cross-party support. We had the largest group of those MPs were Conservative backbenchers. And the Labour Party had officially backed the bill, including the Labour front bench, including Ed Miliband, who's now Secretary of State. And we'll come on to that in a second. But what we chose to do was to accept what the government had offered. Because whilst it might sound like we would have won, in my experience, you need substantially more than half the House of Commons backing you, because of the fact that some MPs, well, they said yes, but then they don't turn up, or, well, you know, the whip talked to me and said, really, this is something that could wait for later, etc., etc. Unfair and perhaps unright that is. I have seen that happen, and so I didn't want to have a situation where we lost a vote on the floor of the House of Commons and then were hugely pushed back in our ambition. And so that's what we did. And the new Community Energy Fund began at the start of this year. And the grants have been going out. And there are already some encouraging examples of new schemes that have been getting money for things like feasibility studies and so on. As another tangent, so often with community energy schemes, a relatively small initial amount of money, 10, 20, 30,000 pounds for something like a feasibility study, is enough to then unlock many times more funding that then gets the scheme built. So this is exciting. £10 million is not enough. It's not even close to enough. Interestingly, the Labour Party pledged to make the fund £400 million if they were to get into government. And again, we'll talk more about that in a second. So that's largely what has happened up until the general election. Support from Labour, including its front bench, and that new fund set up by the Conservatives. I would also like to add that up until our campaign begun, community energy was hardly ever mentioned in Parliament. The government, over years and years, had created a harsher regulatory environment. And so this was a complete reversal in government policy. The first thing actually tangibly done to help the community energy sector in over 6 years. And so whilst it was a tough judgment to make, I am pleased with what happened. And I stand by it. If you helped with all that effort, because huge amounts of people did, that's how we got as far as we got, then thank you so much. I think it's a testament to how people power and politely persisting with writing to your MP, the effect that can have. So then we found ourselves at the election, and we all know the result. It's quite remarkable just how many Labour MPs there are now. And because of the change, we have a very large new number of MPs. There was also a number of MPs who stood down. And overall, what this means is, right now, there is only 152 MPs remaining who backed the local electricity bill before. Now, that's not that surprising. There's nothing we could have really done about it. But it means that we've got to climb back up the hill. However, something much more immediate has been happening, which David did mention. And so there's been lots of fantastic promises from the Labour government, that £400 million community energy fund, for one, but also the fact that, as I mentioned, they backed the local electricity bill last session. Have they immediately set up that new fund or announced it or announced when it will start? No, there's been nothing on that, nothing for many months. Indeed, the last time they mentioned it was early this year. Have they introduced a version of the local electricity bill, or have they promised a timetable for when they will establish the enablement of community energy schemes to sell locally? No, unfortunately, they haven't. There's been nothing. And that's despite us having MPs in the House of Commons stand up at the debates after the King's speech, which comes immediately after the election, asking the new ministers, will we see this? What will we see? So there's been ample opportunity from the new energy ministers, including the Secretary of State, Ed Miliband, to say they're supportive, but we haven't seen it. A lot of people are asking me why, what's going on? Did Ed Miliband not mean what he said? Do they not really like community energy like they keep saying they do? Now, I don't know exactly why. That's the honest answer. But all we can take is what we see. And it may be that they have a fantastic plan that they are about to unveil. But so far, all we have seen is warm words, which is unfortunate and a little bit surprising, given just how enthusiastic and how committed they were before the election. But all we can do is act on what we have. Now, what they have done is introduce a new bill of their own. It's called the Great British Energy Bill. This is legislation required to set up the new Great British Energy Company, which will be one of the key pieces of the policy architecture that the government used to deliver their big plans on renewable energy and energy security over the coming years. Now, that bill contains 4 objectives for the new GB Energy Company. It's quite a short bill. And those 4 objectives are very welcome objectives. They're things like measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Nothing any of us, I would imagine, would disagree with, but they're very broad. The bill has absolutely no mention of community energy or locally based energy, which is very surprising given just how central, if you read even the Labour manifesto, how central they say community energy is to their plans. Again, it may be that they're about to unveil it all tomorrow or next week. I hope they do. But what we have is a bill that doesn't contain one of the things that they say they really want. So this is an opportunity. And so we have introduced an amendment. I say introduced, it will be introduced next week. So it's very timely me talking to you tonight. It's going to be cross-party. And what we're doing right now is we're going to be asking lots of MPs, and if you could please ask your MPs to sign that amendment. It is being put down by the Liberal Democrat MP for Bath, who's called Vera Hobhouse. So it's a very simple request. It's to please sign Vera Hobhouse's community energy amendment to the GB Energy Bill. The amendment simply adds a 5th objective for the GB Energy Company, which is to support the growth of community energy. It's very broad. It's an absolute lowest minimum bar to have. Now, the government might accept it. At the moment, they've said that they won't, but they might. Or we might find ourselves in a position as we found ourselves last year, where they might negotiate and offer us something else. Maybe they'll offer us. Maybe they'll offer to do that £400 million community energy fund they promised. But either way, I think if we push collectively, we'll have a chance at securing something. Now, going back to the local electricity bill, which is really the big fish we're trying to land, if you excuse the fishing analogy, we will have that reintroduced. That is not in Parliament right now. We need to have it reintroduced, and we will do that, and we will seek to get more MPs to support that. But for now, we're focusing on this amendment. So a way of thinking about it is, the short-term battle, the fight that's on right now is this amendment, and that's because it's so opportune. But the long-term big prize is the local electricity bill. I say one more thing before we break out, because I think we're nearly at time, which is, I mentioned how remarkable this kind of work is, and this approach is. You can think back to campaigns like universal suffrage and the abolition of slavery. We are using roughly the same method. Large numbers of people mobilizing on a single, clear, specific ask and asking elected representatives to support it. It's extremely effective. And it's what got the Climate Change Act through. It's what got the first act that I worked on back in 2003 through, which was the Doorstep Recycling Act, which is why we put our recycling out each week. The Labour government of the day didn't want that either. And indeed, the Labour government during the climate change bill campaign in 2008 didn't want it. But to their credit, they responded to the public pressure and they did ultimately support those two acts. And so I think we have a good chance of seeing success again here. So I want to say again, any of you who've helped so far, thank you so much. It is very exciting how far we've come, and I think there's great opportunity to achieve more. I will finish there because I know that we want to have time to go and break out.
Thank you very much, Steve, for a very concise talk, very clear for us what the background is and what we need to do, at least in brief. So, I think many people here have been on these before. We will now go out into our breakout rooms. Now, Steve has given us this time just one question to think about. I'll read it out first. What things are we willing to do now to get our MP to support this? And if they support, push for it harder in Parliament. All right, then, welcome back, everybody. So for the next, we've got quite a bit of time, actually, 25 minutes or so, is your time to ask Steve all the questions that you've stored up. Comments welcome too, but do remember to keep them short, as we need to make sure everybody's got time. The best way is to use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand to ask a question. But raising your physical hand might work. It's just a little bit harder for me to notice. So questions, please fire away. Charles.
Yes, a question for Steve Shaw. In our breakout room, we looked at what's on the powerforpeople.org website, and it wasn't very clear in terms of what's on there and what you, Steve, are now asking us here. So are you going to update your website?
Thank you, Charles. That's a yes is the short answer, and you are right. All I could say is we were a bit stretched. The staff team is smaller than usual, and that's Rishi Sunak's fault. And essentially, I had a choice to make, which was, do I recruit staff before the election? Because we had a couple of staff leave a few months before the election. And I thought, well, I don't know who's going to win. And I don't know if Labour win, which it looked like, whether they'll do what we're asking quite quickly, in which case my staffing needs would be quite different. And so I chose to wait, which I stand by. I think that was the right choice. But unfortunately, it means the staff team is way too small right now for what we are attempting to achieve. And that's why things like what you just said that should have been done already aren't done. So I apologize for that. And that is on the to-do list, absolutely. Hopefully the information I've provided to Ruth that she can circulate is going to be enough for now. We'll sort of get it done as best we can for now.
Just if I follow up, on your website, you suggest, it says here, points to consider, write to them blocks template messages, so please use your own words. So
absolutely, always do that. Yeah, I mean, the words I said were the kind of essential request, but anything you can add your own words is always valuable. Yeah, I mean, MPs largely ignore and don't like template messages.
And also, you like to push the community facts, as you call them. Do you want to comment any of those? There are about a dozen on your website.
Sorry, do I want to do what?
On your website, you suggest to include campaign facts, and there are about a dozen of them on your website.
Yeah, that's just a suggestion. You could, if you like, or one of them stands out to you. It's just to help slightly flesh out your message. It's not necessary. It could be useful. A lot of new MPs, some of them don't even know what community energy is. So just saying something good about it. It's really up to you. The key thing is that your message have the request in it. That's, yeah, it doesn't need to be long.
Right, lovely, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Mark Dick, you're next.
Hello, Steve. Could I ask about the role of the grid and grid capacity? If a lot of community energy projects get up and running, is the grid ready to take these? We've heard stories. I don't know what the situation here in Northern Ireland is, but we've heard stories about the mainland. A lot of projects being backed up and unable to get the go-ahead because the grid's not ready for the extra capacity.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is it's complicated. Is the short answer. There are some areas, yes, where projects get told, no, sorry, there's no capacity. Particularly in the southeast of England, has been a problem, and obviously they've got more solar potential there. But there are other parts of the grid, for example, around older industrial areas in the north of England, where there's actually quite a lot of excess capacity because of the industry that was there. And it's a patchwork. It varies really where you are. Another part of it is that if you actually have more local generation, you can get grid efficiency. If you have better distributed generation and you have people using the electricity closer to where it is generated, you obviously need less of the capacity of the grid to transport the electricity further. So it's not. I must avoid getting into the sort of physics of it, but don't think of it as water. Those of you who don't know exactly how it all works, it's not like water. A lot of people sort of think of it as like water. That's unfortunately not how it works. It's more complicated. But to some degree, there is a sort of there's somewhat useful to know, because you have the grid has these different levels of voltage where substations step up and step down the voltage. So ideally what you want is electricity being used close by and therefore not having to go through a substation and change its voltage. Now, there's some situations where you can't help that. The big wind farms up in Scotland, for example, some of which actually are community schemes. And indeed, another tangent, in Bristol, the tallest single wind turbine in England is the Lawrence Western wind turbine just outside of Bristol, which is a community scheme, and they're plugged in. So you've got these situations where you've got big generation happening, and of course it can't all get used locally. A lot of that electricity generated in Scotland by wind comes down to southern England, and we're not trying to change that. But the only other thing I would say is, you're right, grid constraint and grid capacity is a problem. The reason we haven't tried to tackle that as well right now is we don't want to bite off more than we can chew. And the regional grid companies, they're saying that they want to upgrade the grid. The government's saying they want to upgrade the grid. But the statements and the direction are largely going in the right way. So that's another reason why we've chosen not to push that directly. Now, it might well be that if we succeed and suddenly community energy is going great guns and multiplying many times over, as is possible, then grid constraint really does become the problem, at which point that might be the thing that we'll really need to campaign on. Hopefully not. Hopefully the government will just go, right, well, obviously more investment is needed, and so on. I hope that covers your question.
Lovely, thank you.
Thanks, Mark and Steve. Dave Stevens, you're next.
Yeah. It was just a thought, because I've never done it, but in addition to writing to the MP, let's assume that the amendment doesn't get accepted. Is it also worthwhile writing to key members of the House of Lords, asking them to reintroduce the amendment when it gets to them? And if so, have you any idea who in the House of Lords we could write to?
You can do. It's not really necessary, but for good reasons. We have a range of peers who are very keen to put down the amendment when the GB Energy Bill gets to the House of Lords. There's a very good operation called Peers for the Planet, and we've got quite a large membership. And so the ability to get amendments put down in the Lords is kind of in hand, and I would really encourage, if you're going to do anything and make any effort, and I sort of say this to everyone, is keep pushing your MP.
Yeah.
Unless you sort of if you know a peer very well, then of course please help in that way. But otherwise, I'd say probably efforts best focused at your MP.
Thank you. The next question from Judith Russenberger.
It was a slightly different question. You were saying that there are already some community schemes in operation across the country. I was just wondering if any involve churches and church roofs, because I always see such an obvious place to put solar panels, but churches, congregations don't have the money, but maybe as a community, particularly if there's a way of it, producing a profit.
Yeah, there's certainly some. I think there's a potential for many more. The inability, one of the things that's holding it back is the inability to get any kind of decent return for that excess electricity that's generated and then exported across the grid. So what is usually at the moment what usually happens is there's what's called a power purchase agreement with a licensed supplier, like a big utility that you would know the name of. And the rates that are paid are very, very low. A few sort of pence per kilowatt hour is the average. I think it's about 3.5 pence per kilowatt hour is the average, which is way, so far below what the end domestic rate is. As far as I'm aware, there are, if any, very few community run, as in where there's a sort of local community group that has then got together with the church and then actually got the building to have for the panels, for example. The Church of England, just one more point to add on this, the Church of England have been very, very supportive and helpful on this, particularly bishops in the House of Lords, who on a number of occasions have stood up and pushed the government, well, previously the Conservatives, and I wouldn't be surprised if they'll do it again. So that's been really, really welcome. And the staff who work specifically on this at the Church of England have told me they're very, very keen for this to succeed because they see huge potential for churches.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin McCulloch, that is.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Steve. Actually, Judith's question has raised another question in my mind. Maybe I'll ask two if I can get away with it. My first main question was really about the whole parliamentary process. Is your ideal that the government actually accepts that there's so much support for the amendment that the government also allows it to be voted through? And the other extreme would be that they say, no, this is a darn nuisance. We absolutely don't want this. We're going to whip against it. Is that kind of the spectrum of possibilities? So you want to be on the first end of that I described. Yeah. So is that
That's
something
right.
worth mentioning to an MP? For example, I have a Labour MP who's nowhere. She's brand new at this session, but she's very positive generally about climate and nature issues, amongst other things, and presumably she could then be motivated to try to persuade the minister. Or I believe I could even ask her to ask the minister, and she's obliged to deal with that, if I remember the process correctly. Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. There's lots of things there. On the last thing, absolutely, it's a good thing to ask your MP to write to the minister, or to ask a formal question. They can put down written questions. That's pretty easy. They can also do what's called an oral question. I think it's about every month. There's an opportunity to, in the House of Commons, ask the minister. The minister has to turn up from each department, and you can ask an oral question. So that's a good thing to ask. It's a bit onerous, but not substantially. On your point about saying, I want to pick you up on what you said. She's saying the right things. I really would ask you all, please judge your MP on what they do, not what they may say. Now, if they stand up in the House of Commons and say to the minister, I want you to support this, that's an action. But if they just write a letter saying, oh, I really like community energy, That's not very helpful. As in, if they write a letter to you saying that. If they write a letter to the minister saying, I want you to support community energy, that is helpful. So it is their actions, not just their words, I think, that need to be where we judge them upon and measure them upon. As with all of us, I think, if all I did is say, I want community energy, and then you looked at my campaign and it wasn't doing anything, you could rightly judge me harshly. On the procedural points, you're right. You're broadly quite spot on there with the description. The only thing is, if the government are very powerful, and if the government want to squash this, they can. If they want to say no way, they can. But we need to make it awkward for them, a bit like a thorn that they don't want to step on. That's what we did last year. That's how we got the new Community Energy Fund. And the more MPs that are able to say, and they say this privately in corridors to the minister, I've been there and heard them. I've been in the Commons bar and heard it said. But they say it publicly as well in the House of Commons. The more they say, I'm getting messages from constituents on this, I support this is important, the quantity and the scale, that makes that thorn look ever so much sharper and bigger. Now, they may still say no, but then what they often do, this is the government, is they say, well, look, let's negotiate. Let's talk about it. Now, they don't say that publicly. They say that to me. And then we get a chance to sit down and say, all right, fine, well, what could you do? And we might get a compromise. Mm-hmm. Hopefully we'll get exactly what we want. But if we get something, that's good. And then we'll keep pushing anyway for the next thing. So just because they say absolutely not no to the amendment is not a loss.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Also, one more thing procedurally, if I may. The government if they do accept it and say, yes, we will, we're happy, they will rewrite it anyway and have their own parliamentary lawyers write the wording. And as long as it's largely what we want, that's fine. That's how it always happens. The first version of the climate change bill was 5 pages that we wrote. The final act that went through was 125 pages because the government had picked it up and done it themselves. But it contained the principles from those first 5 pages.
Mm-hmm. Can I just squeeze in my second question, which relates to the whole funding question? There's a group, I understand, I've heard a bit from them, but not much, here in Sheffield, where I live, which has done some community energy, and they engaged in terms of funding just on private houses. They engaged with some financial deals or other, where part of that related to getting carbon credits as well as just the feed-in tariff or whatever it's now called from the energy trading scheme. So it was a carbon offsetting option, and that's actually substantially more, I think, per unit. I don't know if you think is that a useful thing? I mean, it's not directly related to the bill. But,
that sounds very innovative. I haven't heard about that. There are some impressive innovations happening. There's a very impressive innovation in North Wales, in Bethesda, called Energy Local, that have managed to get a virtual effective system going of local generation and local selling along the lines of what we're trying to create. The problem is they are reliant on a benevolent utility to work with them. They're essentially sort of breaking the rules slightly, but the regulator is kind of overlooking it. So there are and there's other examples of things happening. These are whilst they're very impressive innovations from people who are working very hard and are being very clever to kind of almost buck the system, they're not happening at scale, and they're not going to happen at scale because the rules make it too hard for them to happen at scale. And that's why we're campaigning for the rule change. But I haven't heard of that exact carbon credit. That possibly is through a licensed supply. I don't know. I'd be interested in it. Also, you said the feed-in tariff, just to be clear to everybody, those who don't know the feed-in tariff. The feed-in tariff was the subsidy set up under the coalition back in 2010, 2015. Interestingly, political architect of it was Zed Davey. But it was introduced by the coalition government, a subsidy. That's what got a lot of the existing, there's several hundred community energy groups right now that have generation. And it's the legacy contracts they have, because the contracts they got from it would run 20 years. So that's what got the initial surge in the community energy schemes, and indeed in lots of domestic solar as well, not just community energy. But of course, that ended several years ago. It's not been replaced at all, and also we don't want subsidy. You know, of course, subsidy can be good to get you partway, but we can have a situation where it can be its own vibrant sector. You just have to make the rules. You have to make the cost proportionate. And that's what we want. And of course, that resonates well. You know, the fact that there's budget constraints and so on. The analogy I use is like groceries. You think about groceries, the burdens of having a small corner shop on the high street that sells groceries are proportionally smaller than if you have a big supermarket. And that's right. That's absolutely right. And that means that we have small local shops that we can pop into to grab some groceries, and we have massive supermarkets. We are trying to create that with the energy system.
Thank you again for that one. If we move on now to John Anderson, please.
My breakout group asked me to raise churches making their own energy and exporting it. We at Baildon Methodist Church, Bradford, have a 40 kilowatt peak on our roof, and we get paid 15p per kilowatt hour for what we export. So it isn't true now to say you can't get much. You jolly well can if you bargain with the electricity company. In our case, it's Octopus. York Minster is putting 200 kilowatt peak on its roof and will make a great deal of money. And the point I'm trying to make is that what we do with this electricity shouldn't be just to make money, however much it might be. It's who buys it from us. And at the moment, we haven't any say in that. But in both cases here, the community could benefit massively if we were able to have community energy bill, local electricity bill, where we can agree who gets the energy from us. But the smart export guarantee, which what you now have when you export electricity, can be very generous if you bargain.
Yeah, thanks, John. Fair point. All I'd say on that though is, you've managed to get a really good rate there from Octopus, and fair play to yourself, but also credit to Octopus for agreeing that. The trouble is, Octopus really are the outlier. The other big utilities, most of them, if I think not all of them, I don't think would do that. And so, if it scales up, and if let's say you had many, hundreds, thousands of churches doing this, Octopus is not going to be able to agree that many rates with that many churches, and the other suppliers aren't going to. So this is why we can't rely on the benevolence of big license suppliers. We need to change the rule set, as you say. So yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got two more hands up and probably time for two more questions. So Christine Chapman, yours next, if you unmute yourself.
Thank you. This is a very simple question, and I suppose I'm relatively new to all of this, and I've probably not understood what this is all about. In the essence, what is the advantage to a local community in the local electricity scheme? Do they buy it cheaper, or because I've got my electricity now, it's fine. How is it going to benefit me if I'm buying locally?
That's a great question, and something I think I should have, perhaps an oversight, should have covered that when I spoke earlier. So there's two, I think we put it into two groups. The first is community energy groups are very clear that if they could sell locally and face proportionate burdens of doing so, they would be able to offer cheaper electricity, particularly, as I think John just alluded to people perhaps who are struggling with energy bills. So that's the first thing. There is evidence to suggest that you would get cheaper bills, particularly for those who are struggling. But the other thing that's very important is community energy schemes, revenue that they receive, they do other good things in the community. And there's all kinds of examples. There was I can't remember where it was now. Was it Plymouth? They refurbished a local sports centre with the fund that they've got. In Milton Keynes, they have these special thermal cameras that they go into the homes of local people It's a big project they run using the revenue. They go into the homes of local people who are struggling with fuel bills, and they do thermal imaging, and then they can quickly show the places in their home that could quickly and cheaply be improved in terms of energy efficiency, and try and help them reduce their fuel bill. The woman who ran it was brilliant. I remember her saying, "Look, the solar is just a way of getting some revenue, so we can do this. We can do this project to help fuel poverty people locally." There is in Bolcombe in Sussex, they bought 2 big energy efficient fridges for the local food bank using the revenue from their local energy project. But if we scale up all these benefits, and we professionalize the sector, so the scale will be much more substantial. At the moment, there are almost no jobs provided by all these groups. They are very dedicated, impressive volunteers, which is, a credit to them. But it's also remarkably unfair, because unfortunately, it is much more the more affluent communities that benefit from these community energy groups, because they happen to have the kinds of people who have the high acumen and the spare time, often retired middle-class people, who are able to do all the difficult organising for free to get these community energy groups to exist. If you have a revenue stream from local selling, then you professionalise the sector, and you can have these community energy cooperatives, community energy companies everywhere, and poorer areas can benefit as well. Remember what I said about the analogy of the local shops, where you have local grocery stores and big supermarkets? Well, because there is a profit structure and you can have a local grocery store, lots of areas have local grocery stores. It's not a volunteer-led thing. Now, I appreciate there are some areas that struggle, but broadly, pretty much anywhere has local food shops as well as big supermarkets. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make it fairer. So there's a whole range of benefits there. If you we published a report with a lot of case studies that show much more of the information that I just said, and also Community Energy England. They've got each year they publish a report which is really easy to read, and you can see some data on the things I've been saying as well. So yeah, the evidence is strong.
Right. Okay. So these local groups that generate the energy, they've got an income from it, and rather than using that for their their own good, for their profit, then it could be like a charitable organisation to benefit local people.
They're not. I mean, none of them are. Well, I say none. I'm pretty confident that if it's not none, it's almost none of the current community energy groups are run as profit. They're run as community interest companies, cooperatives, trusts. They're run as non-profits. They're in it to do a good thing. They're not interested in making money. And it's very important that the rule set that we change, which is in the bill that we're pushing, keeps that. We don't want it to be a sort of just a profit sector. But I mean, it's not designed to be. So we want to. You see this in the European countries that have a better rule set and have much more community-based renewable generation. It's cooperatives that do it. So that's the idea.
Okay.
Is that helpful, Christine?
Yeah, that does. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks. That was a good question. Okay, we're almost out of time. Judith, you're lucky last. If you've got a quick question, please.
I'm more confused than I was before. So I live in Settle, right? We've got Paul Kelly, the Catholic Church. They've got solar panels, and for about 3 years, we've got these middle class, very hard working, intellectual, not people far better than me. So we're going to have this community energy scheme, which if you live in the right area, so you can either produce energy or you can buy energy from it, and hopefully that'll start working soon. So I've got two points. Our church managed to get, it's probably some of this money you were talking about 2 months ago. They came and did a survey, and having had this survey, they said we needed a heat pump. We could have some more solar panels, but we need to have a 3-phase system. But because we've had this official survey, which probably cost a few £1,000s, we're now eligible for a huge amount, a really huge grant to pay at least £20,000, maybe £40,000 towards getting a 3-phase electricity supply. So the Methodist Church can now also have masses more solar panels, so it can produce energy for this scheme, which is great. So that the message from that was that there is this money to have surveys done, so make use of it if you qualify, because it doesn't get used. It doesn't get used. But okay, supposing our scheme does get off the ground, that's fine. How does this fit in with your scheme? I mean, when your scheme works, does it mean that maybe a different town, maybe Keighley, could do it? And what's the difference between our little community energy scheme and what you're talking about?
So it would allow you to get a higher rate from the electricity you're selling.
I think we're just going to sell it amongst ourselves. We're not even going to try outside, because at the moment it's not worth trying outside. The rates.
Yeah, but beyond the building itself, yeah, when that building is using electricity, it currently gets exported onto the grid, and it could go. I mean, it's not up to you who ultimately is the end customer. It's up to.
We're going to have this scheme within Settle, so people join it. So it'll just get sold within the system, I've been told.
Right. So there's two ways. It could then get done in terms of the future that we're trying to create. One is you directly are selling to someone locally, in which case there's a transaction there. Now that has pros and cons, and there's complications with doing that. Obviously, you have to have billing systems and all sorts. You would need a licensed supplier to facilitate that anyway, which is how the amendment and how the bill we've written works. But another way is you basically have, rather than it being direct, you have it going through the licensed supplier. So you don't see the customers directly, but they are local. It's probably easier to talk about it as a local customer. Imagine there is a new community energy company. So this is the future where we've got this bill through, okay? You either can directly be a customer of it, in which case they're billing you and you're paying them directly, or you are just a customer of the big utility that you always used, but they're making sure that you are effectively a customer of this local scheme. And either one would get the outcome we're trying to create. Is that
okay?
Is that clear?
Okay, thanks very much, because we're getting near time and we do try to finish. But so I know, Judith, you're lucky last there. There is a bit chance to have a chat afterwards if you want to. All right, so as we come towards the end now, it's time to kind of hand over to Barbara for a final prayer and notice of the next workshop.
Thank you, David. And we just end with a prayer. Creator God, the sun, the wind, and the waves are your gifts for the flourishing of the whole community of life on earth. Help us to use them creatively, produce sustainable energy for all. We ask your blessing on all who work for Power for the People. We ask for courage and determination and wisdom for legislators. Create in us a new heart and a new vision, O God, that the gifts of your Spirit may work in us and renew the face of the earth. May we one with you so that our work is yours and your work is ours. We ask this in the name of Jesus, who lives with you and the Holy Spirit forever. Amen. And the next talk is going to be on Wednesday, the 6th of November, when Andy Bauscher, a good number of you will know, and Mark Porter will be in conversation on composing green liturgies, exploring issues you may want or need to keep in mind when devising worship and liturgy relating to the environmental and climate matters. And Mark is a musician, and Andy balances ritual and words in worship. So that should be a good one. But goodness, this has been a good workshop. I'll hand over to David to just bring this one to a conclusion.
Thank you, Barbara. Yes, it has been a great workshop. So thank you very much, Steve, for a very informative and I think inspiring talk. I'm certainly going to sit down now and write off to my MP.